still wake up and go to sleep. Everyone's seen death in their dreams, but we still wake up from our sleep. I'll be home soon. You don't gotta fight alone. You don't gotta fight alone. You don't gotta fight alone. Don't be so personal. Take me out of the road. I'm going under. Take me out of the road. I'm going under. Who do you rely on now? I know the worst. I know the worst. Who can you call on now? I know the worst. I know the worst.
Many lives does it take to realize what's going on? How many years have gone by? When will I reach the finish line? Does it ever end? Is there some reason to all of this? Bit by bit, to all of this. Bit by bit, to all of this. You can try all you want, but you can't change me. I am stronger than you could ever hope to be. You don't deceive me. I see through smoke screens. Blow away your love. came and tucked your way into my heart. Oh, you look at me in ways I never loved. With you I know that this is all, so I don't need to take it slow. If you want me, then I believe that there's a simple remedy. We don't need no miracle, I think we've seen it all, just make the call. I'll come running over. We don't need no miracle, it's unconditional, just make the call, and I'll be yours. I'll come running over. We don't need no miracle, it's unconditional, just make the call, and I'll be yours. Oh, you came and tucked your way into my heart. Oh, you look at me in ways I never loved. With you I know that this is all, so I don't need to take it slow. If you want me, then I believe that there's a simple remedy. We don't need no miracle. I think we've seen it all. Just make the call. I'll come running over. We don't need no miracle. It's unconditional. Just make the call, and I'll be yours. I'll come running over. We don't need no miracle. It's unconditional. Just make the call, and I'll be yours. Don't need a miracle. Need a Oh, you open up a world behind the stars. Oh, you make me see the things I never saw.
Ready? Okay. First of all, for everybody that's online watching this, we are using this manual here from ARRL. All the students here have got this thing already, but this is the one we go by. The neat thing about this book is, if you haven't really examined it yet, in the very back of this book, there's the questions and answers. A little over 400 questions and answers. Out of these 400 questions and answers, you're going to get 35 of them when you come and take the test. Like this thing right here. This is a test we used last year. But anyway, there's 35 questions on here. They're all multiple choice. You have to get 26 of them right. So definitely during the week, we want you guys going to the back of the book and living with these questions and answers. Keep going over them. We recommend reading the question and then reading the correct answer. If you look at these things closely, it's got the question up here. Over in the corner, it'll tell you the correct answer. In this particular case, it's B. It also tells you this number, T5B08. That's like the serial number of the question. And then it also gives you the page number in the front of the book about what talks about the question itself. So when you're back here, you're reading through these questions, you'll find out what the correct answer is over on the sides. Then you can also find out where in this book that the question is actually being discussed. Every one of these questions back here, we are going to go over on this PowerPoint up here. So we'll be going over all these questions on the PowerPoint. You'll be going over them again at home in your spare time. So when that April 9th comes around, when you get that test booklet, you're going to open it up and you're going to read a question and it's going to jump right out at you. I guarantee it. And the correct answer will come right out at you too, because you've seen it so many times. We also recommend going online and taking the practice exams at arrl.org, and there's another one, qrz.com. You can take the practice questions and answers. And that really seems like it helps a lot of people too when you take the practice test. It's qrz.com and arrl.org. ARRL is the Amateur Radio Relay League. The Amateur Radio Relay League, like we talked about last week, is kind of like the American Legion is to veterans. ARRL is to us ham radio operators. So we want you guys to do that. Tonight we're actually going to start learning stuff. Last week was just the introduction. Now we're going to actually start learning about radio and signal fundamentals. And we're just going to be talking about fundamentals tonight. We're not going to get real deep into it, but there will be some things you'll have to know about. Now, before we study radio, we have to have some of this wave vocabulary. The first thing we really should talk about is the amplitude of it. And when we start talking about these radio waves going up and down like this, I'll refer you to the electricity running through this building. Everybody knows that this electricity is 110 volts, 60 cycles, or 60 hertz. We all know that, right? Okay, what that refers to is basically it goes through one cycle, it goes through 60 of them in 1 second, 60 hertz per second. So that's the amplitude, how high it is. The amplitude of these 110 volts, by the way, it actually gets, when it gets up here to the very top, it's actually up around 150 volts. It goes from 0 up to 150, starts coming back down, then it goes down the opposite direction to a minus 150 volts approximately, and then goes back up to 0. And it just keeps doing this. And it does it 60 times in a second. As opposed to the amateur 2-meter repeater on top of St. Anthony Hospital. It does it 140,895,000 cycles per second. It's a lot faster than the 60 cycle stuff. And we're going to show you in a little bit about the big differences between radio waves that happen really fast, like our 2-meter repeater, and then the slower cycle stuff, like the 60 cycles you beat here in the rooms. The hertz, the frequencies. The frequency is how many times this goes up and down per second. 60 cycles, 60 times a second. The repeater, 146.895 million times a second, a lot faster. Hertz, by the way, is named after Heinrich Hertz. He was back at the very start of the amateur radio, right in between the 1800s and 1900s. He was the one that first proved that there was such a thing as magnetic waves. Now, I know you've all heard how Marconi was the guy that invented radio. Not so, it was Hertz. He actually made a little transmitter. It went for about 5 inches is all the further it went. But with that, he was able to prove that there are magnetic waves. Magnetic waves is what we get to play with in amateur radio, these magnetic waves. 100 hertz. The period is in seconds. When we're dealing with frequencies, we're always talking about seconds. Everything is so many million per second, 100 per second. We don't deal with microseconds or milliseconds when we come to radio waves. Now you will in digital communications, the computer's running, microseconds and milliseconds. But in actual radio waves, no, we just deal in straight old-fashioned seconds. The fundamental frequency is a frequency that you guys are actually going to operate on when you turn your radio to the fundamental frequency. In this case, you might have it on 7 megahertz. That's your fundamental frequency. That's what you want to talk to somebody on. But you should realize too that there's something called harmonics, and it's the double or the triple of your fundamental. And what this basically means is if you're on 7 meters and you've got a poorly tuned radio or an antenna that's way out of tune, you will also be transmitting a signal on 14, twice 7. You may also be transmitting a signal on 28, 3 times that. So that's why you got to be very careful when you're tuning your radio, because what will happen is if you're mistuned and you're on 7 meters, you might be talking to some guy in North Dakota. Well, there might be, very probable, there might be some guy in Ireland that is hearing you on 14, the second fundamental. He might be hearing you on 28, the third fundamental frequency. So you do have to be very careful. He's up here in front, Amy. You'll have to be.
Sorry, I'm late.
That's okay. Did you bring a note from your parents? So that's the difference between the fundamental frequency. That's the one you actually want to operate on. Yes, sir.
You said tune your thing up. Is it a dial to turn it? Does it for you?
Yeah, if you put it to 7, that's the fundamental frequency, the one you want to operate on. But because you're mistuned, you will also be putting out a signal on 14 megs and another on 28 megs. And you don't want this because what will happen is you'll have some guy on 28 megs that'll hear your signal and some guy on 14 megs that hears your signal, and they'll be trying to get back to you. You won't even hear them. But because they're transmitting, they're going to be adding noise to the atmosphere. So you don't want that. And they could be just interfering with some other guys wanting to operate on those 14 and 28 megs. The magnetic waves. This is what we play with. This is the force of nature that we use to talk to people on. They're made up of the electric wave and a magnetic wave, electromagnetic. If you will, the electric wave is the power of the wave that pushes it out. The magnetic wave is the one that does the actual work. So we're more concerned about the magnetic wave because they vary simply as the sine wave does. You know, it goes up and down in a regular pattern. And they're just the opposite. When one is going up, the other is going down. The electric wave and the magnetic wave are the two properties of the waves. The electromagnetic waves travel at the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second. That's how fast your radio wave is going out in the air when you key up your radio. 186,000 miles per second. That is around the Earth 7.5 times in 1 second. That's how fast those radio waves travel. The electrons, let's go back. The electrons up here. When I was in high school, in a physics class, my physics teacher made this example. We were studying about the atom. He said if the atom was the size of the Earth, the electron would be about the size of a basketball orbiting the Earth at about 1 foot. Very little thing. One of the smallest things that we actually can prove that exists in this universe is the electron. That's what you guys play with. That's what I play with when we transmit. We are manipulating this electron to make it do things that we want it to do. The transmitter, signal from the transmitter, can make the electrons in the antenna start to move. When these things start to move, it creates that magnetic wave that goes out into the air really, really fast. And the same process works backwards too. When your magnetic wave is out there in the real world, and it cuts through an antenna, that magnetic wave is starting the electrons to flow in that antenna. Just like you've seen a magnet up next to a compass, how it affects the field, same type of thing. Those electrons that are running, starting to move inside your antenna, they go down the coax and into your radio to the other end of the world where you guys are talking to. The power is so minute, so little. You got to make sure on your antenna systems you've got nice clean collections. This is a AA battery, 1.5 volts, right? We all know this. Suppose you take this 1.5 volt battery and you slice it up into 1 million slices, really thin slices, 1 million of them. And then you take one of those little bitty slices out. That's how much power is getting down to your radio. That's the kind of power that's going to come out your speaker. That's why you got to have nice clean connections all the time. But it's that small of a power is getting to your radio. 1/1,000,000th of one of these 1.5 volt batteries. One thing I was asked to show you tonight, does anyone here know how you test a AA battery to see if it's good or not? This actually works. You guys in the back might want to stand up and see this, but if you've got a full battery and you drop it on a table like this, whoops, that's the empty one. If you got a full battery, it goes down and it'll just sit there. If you've got a dead battery, you'll do this. Isn't that amazing? But if you got a full battery, a fully charged battery, you'll stand up. I don't know why this is. Pardon me?
Do that one more time for the camera.
Oh, sure. This is a battery that's dead. It's only got like a 0.5 volt left in it out of the 1.5 volts. And you drop it down and it'll pop over. If you do it just right where you can balance it, when it goes down and hits the table, it'll go really quick. Whereas a full battery will just go down and set. So if you ever need to test a AA battery, that's what you do. Just drop it on the table, and if it sits there, chances are it's a good battery. A lot of people, it's just a little thing I learned on YouTube, being quite honestly about it. I think it's just really neat. But anyway, the point of the whole conversation here is to let you know how weak that signal is that's coming down from your antenna into your radio. And it's all because that magnetic wave went through the aluminum or copper wiring on your antenna, and it set up the electrons to move. Yes?
I got a question. When you're referring to frequency,
over a great distance, is that going to affect the frequency? Is it going to start to spread out? Is that signal degradation? Is that what
It does. We will get to that in the chapter on propagation, radio waves, where we talk about a little bit. We'll also talk about a little bit when it comes to the band plan here. The electromagnetic energy, like I said, hits your antenna and it's transferred from the wave, from the magnetic wave, into the electrons and making the electrons come down your signal, and that can be detected by your actual radio receiver. The electromagnetic spectrum is divided up into a range of frequencies, a whole bunch of different frequencies. That's what this thing is over here. From the very start and down to 0, that's audio. We can hear these frequencies. All the way up through here, and all the way up to here, these are all radio waves. Up to here, we start getting into the light frequencies, where we can see them with our eyes. But these are the frequencies that we'll be using in amateur radio, some of these frequencies. Each range or segment, they have a different name to it, and these different range of frequencies, they all kind of work together alike, but depending on where they're at on here, they do different things. The frequencies up in here, they go in a straight line of sight propagation. If you've got an antenna and if you could see the other antenna, you're going to have excellent communications, line of sight. These up here in the HF band, these are the ones that we really have a lot of fun on, because those are the frequencies that bounce around the world. These are the ones where you can talk to South Africa on and everywhere else. The radio spectrum, I don't know how well you guys can see this up here. This is a very coarse version of this thing over here. They start over here at the VLF frequencies, very low frequencies. These are extremely low frequencies. The neat thing about the VLF frequencies is they will actually penetrate water. These are the frequencies that the Navy uses to talk to the submarines. In fact, if you ever seen a Navy movie with a submarine, you know, nuclear boat going around somewhere, they always have an emergency action message come in on VLF, very low frequencies, because it does get down into the water. We go up to the LF frequencies, which is, oh gosh, not many people use it because of its limited range. The ones we want to be aware of, and you're going to have to know for the test, is the HF, VHF, and UHF frequencies. Now, if you can, I don't know if you can see this in the book or not, where it's at, but you'll notice these numbers right here: 3, 30, 300, 3, 30, 300, 3, 30, 300. When you come in to take the test, write that down: 3, 30, and 300. Because from 3 to 30 is the HF frequencies. These are our shortwave bands. These are the ones that we talk around the world on, between 3 and 30. The next section up is the VHF band, very high frequency. It is from 30 up to 300. Our VHF repeater, our 2-meter repeater here in Effingham, is on 146 megahertz, which falls right in between 30 and 300. So it runs right in here. We have another repeater here in Effingham, on Effingham Equity. It's the UHF repeater, the 440 machine. It stays right in this section here, the UHF, it in between 300 and 3 gigs. So you will have to know for the test, you might not get these questions, but there's usually at least one of them on there. They want to know where HF is, which is between 3 and 30. They'll want to know where VHF is, between 30 and 300. And then they will want to know where the UHF frequency band is, and it's from 300 to 3 gigs. And then they go on up to the very high frequencies. Now, if we'll go over to this scale over here, if you, after the class over, you might want to come up and look at it, because there's a bunch of little X's on here. All sorts of X's through this thing. Where the X's are places where we get to play. These are all our frequencies that we get to play in. There is the 160 meter band, or real low frequencies, the 80 meter, 60, the 40, the 30, the 20 meter. The 20 meter is 14 megahertz. It is just about the most popular band going on the HF frequencies. And then it continues going on up. Other things you should know that's stuck in between all these frequencies, this is WXEF right here. It's stuck in between our 6 meter and our 2 meter band. That's WXEF. WCRA, the AM radio here in town, 1090, that's right here. That's at the very low end of the radio band. So they're going all the way up. These are all frequencies. These things are used by everybody, military. If it's a radio frequency, it's on this thing somewhere. These really high ones up here usually are military, used for military. Some of them are used for like these wireless devices, garage door openers, stuff like that. One of them right here, around 4 gigahertz. That's an interesting one. Has anyone seen the movie Contact with Jodie Foster, where she contacts okay, this is the frequency that she was listening to when she heard contact from Vega. So it gives you an idea of just what all is around. But everything with X up here, you guys get to get on. These HF bands, they start from here and go up to here. From there to there, the HF bands, like I said, these are the ones that will bounce around the world. When we get into propagation, we'll tell you how these bounce around. But those are the ones you bounce around on. From above that, 2 meter bands and on up, these are mostly line of sight stuff, where you have to, one antenna about has to see the other one. Now they will penetrate some buildings, but a rule of thumb is it's line of sight. One antenna has to see the other one. And when we get over the class tonight, these are the actual bands here. This 17 meter band, it shows us where we can operate a voice or where we can operate CW on. And the 17 meter band is right up here. So each one of these bands has a matching spot up here on the overall plan. Those are all the different bands we've got. The really thing that we want to impress upon your mind tonight though, for the tests, 3 to 30 to 300. 3 to 30 is HF, 30 to 300 is VHF, and then 300 and up is the UHF one. So, and it's perfectly legal for you guys to come in when you sit down and take the test. You cannot bring this little note in with you, but it's legal to write it down, get it out of your mind and write it down on the paper, just in case you get one of the 3 or 4 or 5 questions they have on this. Just help you get another question right. These radio spectrums, like I said, they've got a little bit of everything in them. They've got special places for the AM radio bands. You've got an AM radio in your car, you know, 550 to 1710, I think it is. That's all the AM radios in America operates in that particular little band. There's the FM radio band where you can pick up like the local FM stations. They're all grouped together. And then of course there's the broadcast TV bands, and then of course our amateur radio bands. When we're talking about the frequency we're going to be operating on, you can use one of 2 different terms. You can say you're operating on the 40 meter band, or you can say you're operating on 7 point something. The 40 meter band is sort of the area that you're operating in. But if you want to tell somebody the actual frequency, you can tell them like 7. So you can tell somebody, hey, I'm going to be operating the 40 meter band this afternoon. Or if you want to tell somebody, hey, meet me on the 40 meter band, meet me at 7 megahertz. So they're kind of interchangeable. This gets you right down to exactly the frequency you're operating on, whereas this one just gets you the general area of the band you're operating on. And the radio signals. The radio wave carrying information is called a radio signal. If it doesn't have any information on it, it's just a radio wave. It's like a dead carrier, it's like you key up the mic and don't say anything. But if it's got information on it, it's a radio signal. And believe me, there's all sorts of information you can put on a radio signal, from voice, digital communications, television, pictures, the whole ball of wax. Each signal operates or occupies a certain range of frequencies. We'll be getting this in later on. We'll find out that if you're operating Morse code, you're just taking up a little bitty bit of the spectrum. You're not bothering anybody. You're just in a little bitty space by yourself. But if you start operating sideband, you're going to open it up to a lot more space. If you go FM, then you're going to be taking a whole bunch of room. So you have to be aware of how much room you're going to be taking on the band. CW is the best, it's the narrowest, it's the least interference prone. Now, of course, the receivers, they tune into that signal. They tune into that fundamental frequency that you're operating on. That's the whole deal there. Wavelength, oh boy. Wavelength. This 60 cycles going through the lights here, if you were to transmit that out into the air, by the time this 60 cycles completed just one cycle, you know, it does 60 per second. If it does just one cycle, that radio wave has already shot out there 3,000 miles. Yeah, a long way. But if you're on the 2-meter repeater here in town, it operates on 146 megahertz. By the time and that's really fast, you know. The 60 cycles is, but 140 megacycles, that's really, really going through it. By the time it does one of those millionth of a cycle, it only goes out about 6 foot. That's important to know when you're tuning your antenna, when you're designing an antenna. How far out that radio wave travels in one cycle. If you're on the 440 megahertz band, the UHF band, it'll only go out about 12 or 17 inches, really short. So the rule of thumb is, or it's not a rule of thumb, it is a rule, the higher the frequency, the shorter that wavelength is. And we need to know that wavelength, the distance, so we can cut an antenna and make the antenna the right length so the antenna works the most efficiently. The lambda signal is, if you're writing down on your notes the lambda, this upside down Y, that's a symbol for wavelength. The way light waves travel at the speed of light, I just told you it's 186,000 miles per second. In meters, it's 300 million meters per second. 300 million meters and 186,000 miles is the same distance, by the way. Mathematically, you could figure it out, the same distance. So let's think about that. That sounds pretty fast, right? But if your kid has joined the United States Space Force, that's a real thing now, by the way. It's part of the Air Force. And he's stationed on Mars, and he's a radioman up on Mars, and he gets a new piece of equipment in, and he can't remember which switch he's supposed to turn on to make the thing work. He'll get on his mic and he'll call down at NASA headquarters in Houston. Say, hey Houston, this is Mars. What switch do I throw first, A or B? Over, he unkeys his mic, and then you wait. 20 minutes later, Houston will pick up his signal. It takes 20 minutes to get from Mars to Houston, Texas. 20 minutes. And then think about this. The guy down at Houston says, oh, you're supposed to do number B. So he grabs his mic and he says, Mars, this is Houston. You flip switch B. And then you wait 20 minutes. 40 minutes after the guy on Mars makes his request, he'll finally get an answer, 40 minutes later. The Mars rover, when it was up there, it took that long for them to tell the Mars to stop going forward or to make a turn. It takes that long. Even though it's 186,000 miles a second, there's so much space out there that there is a big time delay like that. That's just, of course, you get on Mars. Hams can refer to the bands by the frequency or the meter. You're going to say, I'm operating on 50 megahertz. You could also say, I'm operating on 6 meters. Same thing. 6 meters will give you the general area that you'll be operating in. But if you tell him 50 megahertz, he knows right where to set his radio dial. That's the difference. Now, practice questions. When we go through these PowerPoints, we go through the theory like we kind of just did now, and then we get into the practice questions. These are the questions that might turn up on your test. I don't know if you can see it real well, but down here it says T3B01. If you go to the back of your books on page 11, you'll find the T3s. Because now you can kind of follow along in these questions in the rear of the book. T3C, T3Bs. Page 11-22. You will find a question that is labeled T3B01, and that is this question right up here. And if you own your own book, you can feel free to make notes into it on this question. But anyway, this question may pop up on your test. What is the name for the distance to the radio wave cycle through one complete cycle? That's the wavelength. And you got to know this wavelength so you can get your antenna the right size. The next question is the T3B04. And then how fast do these radio waves travel through free space? At the speed of light. The speed of light. Now, how does the wavelength of the radio wave relate to its frequency? B005. As the wavelength gets shorter, the frequency gets higher. These are real short antennas here. The Ka band, the Ku band, for instance, that's where dish, if you've got dish satellite, that's where it operates in this area here. But anyway, you get down to these lower frequencies, the wavelength is really long. Really long. And as it goes up in frequency, the length of the antenna gets shorter. So as one goes up, the other one goes down. The formula for converting the frequencies to the wavelength is really simple. You divide 300 by the frequency in megahertz. Now, to give you an idea, the 2 meter repeater, 146 megahertz. If you would divide 146 into 300, you'll come out right around 2 meters. It's not exact, it's rounded off. If you're operating on 14 meters, you divide 14 into 300. And that'll give you the wavelength, that's tell you how long your antenna has to be. So it's fairly easy. You just have to know it. I don't think you have to actually do any math on it on the test. But that's the way it is. You just take the frequency in megahertz and just divide that straight into 300. What property of the radio waves identify the bands? It's the wavelength. The wavelength will tell you what band to get in. If you're in a, 2 meter, you're in this band right here, you're in the VHF band. So it's the approximate wavelength too, it's not exact. When you are designing an antenna, say to use on 14 megs, or let's say pick a different frequency, 21 megahertz, that's the 15 meter band. If you're on the 21 megahertz band, you'll figure out you divide 21 into 300 and it'll come out 15 meters long. But you'll find out that in the real world, then you only take half of that and that'll make you your dipole. And it works out to about 22 feet long. So that's why you need to know how to get the wavelength. Oh, here we go. The frequency limits of the VHF spectrum. Remember, 3, 30, 300. The first one is HF. The 30 to 300 is VHF. And then the next one up is the UHF band. And its frequency is from 300 up to 3 gigs, which is, this is 3 gigahertz right here. You can convert that, move the decimal point, come up with gigahertz. Of the UHF spectrum is 300 up to 3. And the HF band, like I said, this is our big playground that we operate in a whole lot. The frequency range is the 3 to 30 megahertz. Like I just said, the 21 megahertz, that's right in between there. The 14, it's right in between there. These are the 3 you'll need to know. The VHF, UHF, and the HF bands. And like I said, if you get in, when you come in to take the test, take your scratch paper and the first thing you write down is 3, 30, and 300. HF, VHF, UHF. And you've got a question answered correctly. What is the approximate velocity of the radio wave as it travels through free space? 300 million meters per second. The same thing as 186,000 miles per second. 300 million meters per second. Goes pretty fast. What is the unit of a frequency? Right? It's the hertz. I just told you Heinrich was the guy that first proved that there was such a thing as a magnetic wave. He actually was the one that made the first radio transmitter. And this was, like I said, back in he did it, I think it was in the very late 1800s yet. I don't think it was even in there. This is a question, what does RF refer to? It stands for radio frequency. And when they say RF, they mean all types of signals, not just ones with information on it. If there's a radio wave out there, if it's just a dead carrier, it's still considered RF, a radio frequency. It's all of these frequencies from just above audio all the way up to the light. These are all radio frequencies. Into the modules. Time is it? Wow, that went really quick. Okay, this is module 2. We need you guys to go back home this weekend now and study module 3. Module 3 is about electronic components, a little bit about circuitry, that kind of thing. Next week for module 3, it's going to be a long one. It's going to be about 2 hours because there's just a lot of stuff. I don't know why they didn't split it up. They didn't. So we're just going to have to tough it through. So next week, make sure you bring some coffee with you or buy some from up here or something because it will be a long, hard journey. Interesting. We'll keep it going for you. So, capping off tonight, we know that for the test, you know that you're going to have to know that 3, 30, and 300 to get a couple questions right. You know that radio waves travel at the speed of light. And the speed of light, although it's really fast, if you're a long way from the receiver, like if you're on Mars and he's on Earth or something, it's going to take up to 20 minutes for that radio signal to get there. You may have kind of experienced this watching the news. The guy at the news desk in New York, he's talking to some guy in Podunk, Iowa, and he'll ask a question, and then there's that silence, and then the guy answers. That slight delay, that isn't because of the radio waves, that's because of the electronic equipment in between. But it gives you an idea how disconcerting it can be for you for these radio waves to take, even though they're going really fast, it does take a while for them to get through everything. With that, we will be ordering 2 more books because we've got a couple gentlemen here tonight we'll get books for. We want you guys to constantly go to the back of this book. Now when you're reading chapter 3, 2, 4, 2, 1, here we're 3. Chapter 3's got about 18 pages to it that you got to read about. They will have these questions here. These questions, by the way, we'll be going through on the slides. So if you want to go through them, great, but you don't have to because we will go through them on the slides. But just read this stuff. You might not get a clear understanding, but that's what we're going to be here for next Thursday night, is to clear up any of your questions and stuff. I think that's about it.
All right. Well, does anyone have any other questions for this evening?
If you set up a dipole, say 2 meters,
Mhm.
are you defeating yourself for using 10 meter?
If you do that, that's when you can start transmitting fundamental or harmonics. You can transmit. You can hook up a 2-meter radio to a 10-meter antenna. It will get out, not very well, but it will get out. But what it'll really be doing is 2 things. It'll be reflecting some of that power back down into your radio, dissipating inside your radio as heat. This is a no-no for the transistor finals. I burn them up. And the other thing it's going to be doing is transmitting out this harmonic frequency, which will be screwing up somebody else somewhere else. But yeah, you can use any frequency on any antenna. It just won't work very efficient. Just that easy.
Can you repeat the questions that way? The microphone picks up?
Oh, okay. I will. Any other questions?
I actually have one.
Yeah.
I'm looking through this book and I want a little clarification because on a picture it shows on page 2-3 it shows cycle and it's measuring it between like median points of the rise and fall, which evidently is the same distance as the wave, which according to other pictures is from peak to peak.
Yeah.
So is the actual location on this irrelevant?
No, as long as you take the same location every time.
Okay, so
You can
cycle
start.
doesn't necessarily mean from midpoint to midpoint. It can mean
Yeah.
from peak to peak. etc.
It can be from the peak of one to the peak of the next, or you can measure it from the 0 point where it starts to go up, back down through the 0, back down under, and back up again. As long as you hit the same mark all the time, that'll be your complete cycle. Yes, sir. Pardon me?
If you have a higher wavelength, then you get the signal further.
No, it's just the opposite, actually. The higher the frequency is, he wanted to know if the higher frequencies would go further. No, the higher frequencies are line of sight. They don't go that far. If something gets in the way, it cuts off. Whereas the low frequencies, they will have the tendency to bounce off the atmosphere around the world. Yes? Oh, okay, the high wavelength. Yeah, okay, talking wavelength now. Yeah, if you've got the higher wavelength, the longer the antennas, then they will go a lot further because those longer wavelength antennas, they're lower in frequency, but the wavelength is longer. They are the ones that will bounce off the atmosphere and come back down on the other side of the world. They bounce off the F1 and F2 layers up on the ionosphere. We'll be going over that in the propagation series. Any other questions? Okay. If not, then by golly, we'll see you all next Thursday night. Make sure you read chapter 3. I do hope that you guys will make an effort to go through those questions in the back of the book. It's more important really to read those questions than it actually, to pass the test than it is to actually know the stuff. But if you know the stuff, if we're going through it and you know the stuff, then by golly, you're going to know it forever and ever.
Thank you all very much for coming
Yep.
out. Y'all are more than welcome to hang around as much as you want.
And ask questions.
Yeah, ask plenty of questions. I'm a ham radio operator. Got Russ, Byron, Doug sitting over there. Anyone else that's operator?
Kurt, he'll answer your questions. So anyway, glad you